All right, so welcome to the Stand Canada Town Hall meeting as part of the conference on promoting reflexivity to genocide of Indigenous peoples. That's also our director's conference for January. We're going to go around and introduce ourselves first.
Great.
Start.
So, hi, I'm Scott Fenwick. I'm Stand Canada's executive director. Been with the organization for many years, starting with the University of Alberta chapter in Edmonton, and that's where I still live.
I'm Allison Chen. I am the Human Resources and Operations Director for STAND, and I was also on the conference committee, planning this committee.
And hi, I'm Adi Burton. I'm the chapter's co-director, and I also was involved in the planning of this conference.
Hi, I'm Priya Ramesh. I'm policy co-director of STAND, and I'm from Calgary.
I'm Katerina Todic. I'm policy co-director along with Priya, and I'm from Toronto, and I was also on the conference planning committee with Allison and Adi and Maria.
And shout out to Maria.
Yeah,
shout out to Maria. Super helpful person who was very much involved in this, and we thank her a lot officially.
Yeah. Yes. I'm Tori Fleming. I'm the chapter's co-director with Adi, and I live in Toronto.
I'm Evan Gray. I'm the co-director of communications along with Sarah. You can see in the top right of your screen there.
Maybe different configurations for people, but she'll introduce herself.
Top right of our screen.
Yeah.
I don't think my head's in there.
Whatever, you can just hear my voice. Hi, I'm Natasha. I'm the chapter president of STAND UBC, and I am from Vancouver.
I'm Yumi. I'm also with STAND UBC. I'm a VP Defense, and yeah, excited to see what it's about.
Awesome. I am also dealing with the people who are trying to sign on to this, so hold on. Why don't
So hi, I'm Sarah. I'm the co-director of communications along with Evan. I'm in Toronto, Skyping in or Zooming in, I guess as it were. I largely manage the blog content.
Soleil, do you want to introduce yourself? You're on mute right now. There you go.
Yeah, hi, I'm Soleil. I'm with the communications team at EBC, although I'm currently in Australia.
Thank you.
I'm Miriam. I'm the president at UFT, and I'm also zooming in from Toronto.
Awesome. So I know Stan Laurier is here. There's one or two people, I think. One of them is probably Jenna, the president, and I think Jessica, the vice president, are on. But they don't have mic or webcam capability, so they're just going to listen. Sasha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sasha, and I'm coming in from Western in London, and I'm part of the communications team.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Scott to introduce the conference and the point of this call.
Okay, and I trust that someone will fill in any gaps that I inadvertently leave, because there is definitely a lot of information that we've been discussing over the last couple of days. So the purpose of this town hall meeting, as well as with this conference that we've been having in Vancouver, has been like what as an organization we can do and should be doing in response to the Truth and Reconciliation reports, especially in its confirmation that there was cultural genocide in Canada. As an organization, we made sure that we alone don't call something genocide unless we have other sources backing it up. So in the case of cultural genocide in Canada, it is the Canadian government itself. This is why we acted upon it in an official capacity. So when it comes to this and STAND, we don't have Canada as a focus region. Our mandate as it stands right now is concerning Canadian foreign policy. So there are very many questions on how we should treat this in terms of what we do in our day-to-day operations. So to make it clear, so that everyone is on the same page, we are trying to facilitate a dialogue and consult with you, our chapter members and volunteers, on how we should approach this. No decisions have been made, and when we were going about our discussions over the last 2 days for this conference, we were meeting with consultants that have significant background with Indigenous issues, particularly as it relates to cultural genocide in Canada. So we've dealt with a lot of content, very heavy, dark content. So we feel that we are in a position to at least make suggestions to the organization's membership and basically feel the temperature, essentially. Do you have?
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. And I guess I should also note, to add for greater clarification, many of you may be familiar with the fact that we do have a procedure in determining focus regions, but that is generally with genocides that are in progress as we're discussing it. When it comes to historical genocide, this is actually new territory for us. And one thing that is made clear in the TRC report is that genocide has an intergenerational effect. You may have been referred to as intergenerational trauma. So to this day in 2016, the effects of genocide, or cultural genocide as the TRC puts it, are still being felt. And I do feel that there are implications for our focus regions, because it does at least emphasize that even if genocide stops, that intergenerational trauma is still going to be there.
And that there are a lot of like structural things that contribute to genocide, and we've covered a huge range of topics today, or this weekend. And the scope of this is huge, and this is a real challenge for us as an organization to figure out like what part of it are we going to look at, if any. And we want to make sure that all the membership is involved in this. So it's really exciting that all the active chapters are attending this call right now. And especially UBC came in person, and people who came across time difference and made time in their busy lives. So thank you so much for joining us. Does anyone have anything to add before we move on to the next thing? Okay, so because we've been working and thinking about this for a few days already, it's kind of hard for us to gauge where you guys can jump in and how jarring of a transition that would be. So one of the things that we want to do just to kind of get the discussion going is extend the discussion that we've been having all weekend to you guys. One small aspect of this conference was the question of cultural genocide and how is it different from what Ali says, actual genocide, but not actual genocide, cultural genocide and genocide as we've been dealing with it in the past. So this is a new term for us. We've never had to deal with it before. Is it within our mandate? We don't know. So we wanted to kind of like start a conversation about this as a way to open up the town hall meeting and hopefully like organically bring forward a lot of the concepts and topics that we're going to be discussing later. So when we're talking about genocide versus cultural genocide, does anyone have like an understanding of cultural genocide that they'd like to put forward, or a distinction?
Well, like I know I did some preliminary research before coming into this town hall, but I know that with cultural genocide, I think personally I find that it's just as troubling as, not to say actual genocide, but actual genocide, just because when you're like eradicating the culture of a people, and after so many generations, that culture and that language and that heritage starts to kind of deteriorate, I think that it should be considered genocide in a form, because although the people are still ethnically present, I think that if culturally their heritage and their history is gone, then I mean, it's kind of the same thing, especially if we are talking about, you know, the Indigenous peoples of Canada and like the residential schools that they were put into. So I'm glad that we are having this conversation, because I think a lot of people do kind of, you know, say that, you know, cultural genocide isn't as concerning or as alarming as, you know, actual genocide. But in my personal opinion, I think that eradicating the culture of a people, you might, like, it's just, you're pretty much erasing an entire group of people at the same time. So that's just kind of my preliminary understanding of it, but I know that you guys probably have more of a technical definition for that.
Not necessarily. Thank you so much. It's a really hard question. We've been really struggling with it. Anyone else want to share? Anyone from the in-person group too?
I think a lot of the experiences we've had this weekend, it wasn't necessarily technical. It didn't really fit into that, oh, the 7 criteria for is this a genocide? It was a lot about learning about the personal experiences and also learning the impact that genocide have on their community and also society and governmental levels. So that's what we talked about this weekend.
Yes, thank you, Allie. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I haven't really parsed through the entire Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, but for me, it's sort of a semantic debate, and I think the distinction for us between cultural genocide and actual genocide may not actually be particularly useful in a lot of ways. My understanding of it is that it was sort of genocide by different means. So the aims of eliminating a culture, wiping it out, in favor of this supposedly superior white settler culture, not really that different from other historical genocides that have taken place. It's just that the primary means might have been different. We usually think of genocide as taking place through mass slaughter. There was certainly killing that went on from settlers to the indigenous communities that existed in North America before it came, but the fact that the primary means of eradicating this culture were through less violent things like, or supposedly less violent things like the residential school system, trying to sort of efface the indigenous culture from Canada's society, things that are just as damaging on a structural level, but might have a different sort of face. They're not as recognizable as genocide, given the sort of criteria that we commonly use to understand it. So that's my understanding of it.
It's a good point, because we've actually been grappling with that issue of how do you bridge the gap between cultural genocide and actual genocide in terms of reconciliation. Like, is it rude and also insulting for Canadians, like settler Canadians, to sit there and say, well, this isn't genocide, this is cultural genocide? Where do you draw that line?
And people died.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't really understand what the distinction is personally.
Yeah, me neither.
I think just a friend of mine who's provided a lot of awesome advice about this conference sent me a message yesterday on Facebook to say that something that she wants to contribute here is that she thinks that cultural genocide is kind of a loophole that the TRC found to avoid getting into a legal argument and like lengthy court case probably with the federal government. So that's like one take there, that this is just like a kind of political and purely semantic move.
I think cultural genocide also takes multiple generations to see the effects of, because this weekend we heard a lot of those speakers say that, oh, the effects of residential school is multi-generational. So it's through all these missing generations and all these people who have been affected by, what went on in residential schools that lead to the high death rates and problems.
We should also just add that genocide is just a late 20th century term, which is very much evolving.
Yeah.
And for us to diagnose what happened in Canada as cultural genocide, almost like it's like a subsection of genocide, I think that's the rhetoric of the TRC. I don't think it would be inappropriate for us to just start calling it genocide, if that's our understanding of it.
And then another piece of advice that I got from people while we were creating the conference is that some people were offended by our use of the term cultural genocide, because it diminished the deaths of people and the very, very traumatic impact.
It's also important to keep in mind that as the drafts of the legal definition of genocide were being circulated and being finalized into the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, there were particular things like whether or not there was actual intent to commit genocide. In many cases, people may be willing to say that even if you didn't intend, it's still just as serious.
Well, they had a specific intention of like,
Assimilation.
Johnny McDonald said to take the Indian out of the child, right?
Yeah, that's
And
correct.
like Dr. Yellowhorn said yesterday, right, these residential schools were built with cemeteries lined up. Like they knew that children were going to die here.
So,
They prepared.
but in general, that's one problem with the legal definition. And then the other is the specific groups that were excluded from the definition. So legally it's national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. But like Joseph Stalin did make sure to exclude social and political groups from that definition for selfish reasons.
Well, that goes back to the whole debate that we're having with what is cultural genocide. Is it different, right? Because if you're sitting, like, are we going to classify genocide based on the means of committing said genocide? Like, is that the way it's going to be? Like, you have to have a certain amount of weaponry or intent in terms of actual physical annihilation, or is that annihilation a cultural annihilation? What is the actual difference between the two?
And is there like a number? I feel like that's the debate that's happening a lot in like the scholarship around genocide. Like, when does like a hate crime, for example, become genocide? Like, it's very non-specific. Does anyone from the virtual group want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I just would agree that it's, I mean, for these purposes, largely the same thing as an actual genocide. And yeah, just when I was doing some research for this too, about just in terms of like the legal definition, how earlier like elements of cultural genocide were actually part of the definition that you'd use to define a genocide, but Canada was part of the groups that worked to take that out of there. So I guess it's interesting what you said about it being now like a loophole in the TRC. I think that would make sense.
I agree. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's kind of covered what we kind of discussed in our group with regards. It's a very complex topic and also one that I don't feel entirely knowledgeable on, so I don't want to say anything that I regret in 30 years' time or something. Yeah, I would just say.
Anyone else from the virtual group?
I mean, just to sort of touch on stuff that I know that's already been said here, I think for the purposes of our understanding of it, cultural genocide in and of itself is equal to genocide in this case. And again, I'm going to put back to something I've spoken about over the weekend, which is this concept of reconciliation and transitional justice. And for those purposes, for the purposes of healing, being able to sustain and support and celebrate your own culture is such an important part of healing from post-conflict, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what your culture may be. So I think for the purposes for our purposes, sort of differentiating, I mean, yes, it is important to put cultural genocide, but because we're looking at it from a reconciliation perspective, because we're looking at it from a healing and okay, so how are we going to fix this going forward perspective, the culture aspect is not to diminish deaths or anything, but it's almost all we have left to deal with. You can't bring back people who have died, but you can make sure that their memory is maintained and is respected. And one of the big ways to do that is through culture. And I think the acknowledgement by both the Canadian government, but increasingly by the Canadian population, and sort of saying, yeah, okay, that destruction of culture that the colonists came in and sort of engaged in was extremely detrimental and has had extremely broad spectrum resounding impacts on the course of both Indigenous affairs in Canada, but also just Canadian history in general, incorporating everybody. I've always been a big proponent of the belief that there is no differentiation between cultural genocide and regular genocide. The destruction of the culture of a people is the destruction of the people itself. That's just my personal belief. I think there's definitely a difference to be made between outright destruction of a culture and amalgamation or change, evolution of a culture. And I think it's pretty clear to see, you look back on Indigenous history in Canada, and there was a concerted effort to destroy a culture. And in and of itself, we can see how that has maybe not completely destroyed, but definitely really, really had a very, very negative and long-lasting intergenerational impact on the Indigenous populations in Canada. So just to kind of put a general comment out there, that's why I think this is so important that we are looking at this within the context of what STAN does, just because being able to understand how this particular situation and how we deal with the culture and cultural genocide does definitely shape the way we view research and understand the practices of what's going on in either our regions of focus or in other areas that we as an organization might be interested in exploring.
Sarah. Sasha, do you want to say something? No pressure. You're on mute if you're trying to. It's always hard to tell with these things. If somebody wants to talk, okay, well, let us know if you want to talk. Anyone else want to chime in before we? I think we've covered a lot.
I don't know. Personally, I feel like debating the distinction between cultural genocide and genocide too much risks trivializing the issue slightly. But I think it is a conversation that we have to engage in, because that terminology is out there. It's in the report. For all intents and purposes, it is the legal definition of what happened in Canada's history that people within the government are going to be working on. And a lot of people just in broader society, I think, are hesitant to take that next step to accept that, yes, an actual genocide, not a qualified genocide, was perpetrated against Indigenous people in Canada. So I think that we have a role in maybe facilitating that transition or explaining the distinction or the lack thereof from our perspective, and yeah, making it a little bit easier for people to understand why this conclusion was drawn, and also why it perhaps doesn't go far enough.
I wish we had someone here who could play devil's advocate for us, just to bring some more to the conversation, probably, because it feels like a lot of consensus happening, which is good. What I think, though, that we want to bring to you guys who couldn't participate throughout the weekend is that I think this speaks to like a really big question for STAN related to the scope of our work of where does genocide extend? So we've heard from many different people over the weekend that cultural genocide in Canada manifests as dispossession of land. It manifests in the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. It manifests in residential schools and a whole host of other issues. So if we were to say as STAN, okay, we're going to look at all these things, we're talking about everything from housing policy to the environment to all it. That's a huge breadth of subject matter for us. So I think our job to start here is to try to carve out what is it that we want, that we are able to take on at this time, and that we want to take on as an organization. And again, this isn't the place where all the decisions are going to happen. This is a discussion and a forum to talk about it. And then I hope that I'll be getting emails from people and that you'll be thinking about it throughout, and that we'll be hearing more from the national volunteers as well as they do other work. So one thing that I want to share before we move to talk more about these issues is the conference that we organized. We worked really hard to make it accessible for everyone in Canada or anywhere who wants to participate in the discussion and hear the things that we heard. So we had multiple sessions throughout the conference. You can see the schedule online. And we even had some that weren't on the schedule. So we have recorded all of them. What we're going to do is send those recordings to each of the speakers and give them the final say whether they consent to it being put up on YouTube or distributed internally within STAND. So we hope that we'll be able to have YouTube videos of each of the sessions. I think one of them has kind of like corrected audio, but the rest of them have audio and video. The one with Natty, no.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
But I think at least pieces of it should be okay, and maybe we can try to fix the audio, because that was a really good session. We also got a lot of our speakers to do a short little message for us. What is the thing that they would like us to hear from them, especially from the participants who are Indigenous. We thought that it was a really important initiative to make sure that we would be able to listen to what they have to say specifically about this topic, and we're going to compile that video together and distribute it widely. In addition, we also are going to be working with the communications and policy teams on assigning each of the sessions to them and then asking them to write a blog post about one topic related to the session. So if any chapters are interested in participating in that as well, or have other ideas of how we can kind of maximize the reach of this conference, we're very open to hearing about it. Those are kind of the preliminary ideas that we put together over the weekend. Does anyone have any other ideas? Oh, and then we also had the open forum yesterday, which the results manifested in an extraordinarily long list of questions, which I think is great to look over for everybody, and we'll be putting that up online.
And you guys can add to it if you think of something we've missed.
Yes. And we can keep that conversation going. We're also talking about continuing our relationship with each of the speakers that we've reached out to who agreed to participate, and those who couldn't participate as well, and try to continue our podcast series on this matter as it relates to genocide more broadly. So those are some of the ways that we've talked about bringing the conference to you and continuing the conversation. But in terms of STAN's relationship to genocide in Canada, that's the big question on the table. And we don't have necessarily like a more structured way of tackling it. So I'm going to open the floor and see what happens. And then we will correct if need be. There's deafening silence, please no.
Just to add to that, I think the main question we're trying to figure out is what is our scope as an organization? What's the opportunity at hand? Is it something that we should dive into, or is it something that we should kind of see what other organizations are doing first before we step into it? And we all have different perspectives on it. This is also one of those questions where if any of you or anyone here feels like absolutely not, this is not a direction we should be going in, you should say it and state why, because it's good to know.
Or email us if you don't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Personally, in my view, I think that although it is ambitious to take on this topic in our mandate, I think that even though it is historical, because the effects, like you guys said, have been felt throughout generations and is still affecting Indigenous peoples today, and on top of the fact that it is a Canadian issue, so we have real opportunity to contact our policymakers and kind of make a real difference. I personally think that, like I said, although it's ambitious and it is going to be a lot of hard work and it's complicated just because there are so many different sections underneath the scope of Indigenous cultural genocide or just genocide in general, I think that our mandate and everything that we kind of stand for would kind of necessitate that we do at least seriously consider taking on this topic and including it in our mandate, especially because personally I'm fairly passionate about this topic, and I think that a lot of people think that this was just a historical thing that happened and now it's done, but any Indigenous person that you meet today can tell you how these historical events have affected and shaped their lives. So personally, I think that we should take it on, but I do kind of recognize that it is going to be difficult and it is going to be kind of hard to, tackle on the different parts of it. So I guess, I mean, it's up to the broader group, but personally, I think we should do it.
I think that another thing that this conversation has taught us is that there's more nuance that we could bring to our focus regions as well, to understand the scope of what the conflict is, and to understand how, like we've said it before in like official documents and stuff, but haven't really delved into it in a significant way, that genocide doesn't have a beginning and an end, and that it's very complex and involves lots of factors and is intergenerational in its impact. So I think that even by looking at the issues here, that teaches us a lot about the other issues that we're looking at elsewhere.
And I think it's important that we can embrace and adopt Canada's genocide in various different ways. Like we could either be like active proponents. What I'm saying is essentially there are different ways we can tackle this subject. And it can either be from an educational standpoint where we incorporate it into our educational program and we work with like-minded organizations or organizations that directly deal with this issue to help promote a message that they're shaping, but we can have consultation in it. Or we could be actively proposing policies for it, or we could just use it as a reference point to the issues we are approaching in our current mandate.
And there's probably more options that we haven't thought of.
I think it's just important to think about all the different ways we can tackle this subject.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's a complicated subject. I'm very much in agreement with what you were saying, Miriam. It's a huge undertaking, but I feel like it's one of those topics or issues which is so current and so accessible to everyone in STAN because we are Canadians. The impact we can have, I think, is much, much, much greater than the impact we have had in the past regarding our focus regions because we are at a geographic disadvantage. We don't have researchers on the ground here. We always talk about how we can use our resources best, and this is one of those topics where we could use our resources extremely well and acquire more.
Yeah, I think it's actually really be a really amazing thing to do because a lot of students don't really know the impact that it's had, and it's such a new topic and all this new information is coming out that we've never had before. So I think as chapters, we really have a way to educate students and kind of make a difference because it's so new. And I think it's something so important as well because it did happen in Canada, and we're always talking about regions that are far away, but now we're talking about something that's close to home. People will be intrigued and really want to learn more, I think.
And I also wanted to add that I think right now would be a really good time to kind of broach this subject just because with the changing of the government, I think that the federal government is a lot more open to kind of going back to this topic and kind of approaching it with more of an open mind. Whereas I know like with the inquiry into the missing Indigenous peoples, I think that was a really important first step. So I think that personally, I think now is kind of the time. And I think that we should at least kind of look into, like Tori was saying, there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of, deal with the subject. We can even do like fundraisers and start, using those funds to help existing organizations in Canada that kind of help not reverse the effects, but kind of make up for the effects of the cultural genocide. So I think that at this point in time, I mean, we have a lot of resources and we kind of can direct our questions to policy makers directly, as opposed to a lot of the other focus regions that we kind of cover, where it's like we have to kind of use the Canadian government as a middleman to kind of, voice our objections or voice our opinions. Whereas now it's like we can directly go to the source and we can try to like affect actual change. So I think that with the Liberal government, I think that they are kind of a bit more open to approaching the subject. So I think if we do decide to take this on, I think it would be a lot more easier than it would have been in the past. So I think that's something to consider as well as we're discussing this kind of taking on of a new focus region.
And when we're looking at Stan's work, really like there's a shift that we can make here as an organization together, from talking about like, you know, humanitarianism kind of motivated work where we're going to go and help people, to responsibility motivated work. What is our responsibility as Canadians to the people who live here and who this is their Indigenous homeland, right? And then what is our responsibility to people in Sudan who, you know, the Canadian politics does have an effect, and the Canadian economy does have an effect on that conflict. And in South Sudan and Myanmar and Iraq and Syria, very much in the forefront right now. And we can use this platform for discussion, I think, can provide a lot of feedback into the entirety of our work and make us better as an organization in a really substantial and ethical way, in my opinion.
I can play devil's advocate if you want.
Yeah, please. Personally, I'm really fascinated by all the points that have been brought up. First of all, like the idea that we can have a much more tangible impact at home, I think is definitely an exciting like prospect in a way, because often in these situations you feel very distant from what you're trying to achieve, and this I think is definitely a very exciting opportunity. At the same time, and I'm sure some of the directors know, members of the UBC at least have expressed hesitation when it comes to adopting Canada as you know, as a focus region in particular. Just I think given, and this I guess kind of goes back to this whole thing of genocide as we understand it in the conventional sense versus cultural genocide, it's kind of like which is the more immediate concern in a way. And I know that in adopting, I think Canada, it could maybe detract from potential crises abroad that are very much, you know, very stark and very in your face, kind of, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening.
Or with imminent humanitarian crises, and ones that are like very much underway.
Yeah, and I think that's like what I've kind of understood within Stand UBC. Personally, I do think it's very important we at least have a stance or have an opinion or put something out there, although to the degree, like you mentioned before, like in what way we want to do that is, I guess, where all the debate will come in. I don't know if you want to add anything to me.
At UBC, I was more concerned about not seeing one as like more important than the other, or I know effects are not as detrimental as they are, but it's just kind of a concern about should we deal with more immediate threats right now, or should we kind of divert our resources and deal with things that are underway and are important to us, but maybe not exactly immediately life-threatening. So,
I'm just going to add one more thing to that. I just remembered. I think the other thing is that when you're dealing with crises like South Sudan and Myanmar, and Iraq and Syria, our members can barely wrap their head around one of those focus regions. And I think obviously different chapters are going to be different, and the people in like national and chapters, you know, everyone is going to have different capabilities. But I think with Stand UBC, it's been, I don't foresee adding another focus region. I don't think that's going to be a very easy transition. And I'm not sure us as a chapter would be able to give it the due diligence that it deserves, because we can barely keep up with the 4 that we already have. And I think that, you know, like I think it's been mentioned before, could lead to a potential just decline in everything because we're trying to deal with too much. So those are just a couple of.
We weren't suggesting adopting this as a focus region.
Okay, sorry, I know I have things that come in, so it wasn't exactly true.
But no, that's good. Part of this is just to kind of understand how chapters are receiving our message, which is what my understanding is. People are thinking, oh, we're going to adopt Canada as a focus region. We don't know. 1, 2, you're right. Maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe we have to look at it in a completely different way. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, no. I think sort of our very rudimentary initial thinking
just to add a bit more content in this regard to our educational programming, to blog posts and our other activities, not to.
Well, we have our specific recommendations for the short term that we've put together, and we'll talk about them today. And then, basically, there's also another aspect of this that we haven't talked about, that we are not an Indigenous organization. As far as I know, there are no Indigenous people participating in this conversation, and we were very conscious of that in the conversation throughout the weekend. Something that I didn't say before, that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people right now in this physical space, and you guys are in your locations. And I encourage you to look up, if you don't know already, whose territory you are currently on, and to recognize that there's a degree to which, there's a limit to which if we are committed to reconciliation, that might require that we relinquish the role of leaders and instead adopt the role of followers. And that is a complicated thing that a topic we've been trying to broach with different Indigenous groups, and that's going to be a long and evolving discussion. So in the long term, there's a lot to talk about, and I think the focus region issue is a long-term discussion, not something to be made hastily and without consultation.
Just to kind of add on to what Adia is saying there, because I also have similar concerns as the UBC chapter in terms of scope creep in particular. But I think that the difference in terms of our ability to communicate to the chapter level might come in from the fact that, hey, this is something that's happening in Canada, so by that very nature, it stands out in everybody's head when we see a communication about it. But to me, I almost view this situation, and this is just my external opinion, nothing to do with the directors in general, but it's almost like when anything else comes up, right? Like with the situation in Burundi. Okay, so we need to pay our due diligence. We need to actually discuss it and sort of say, okay, here's why we're not adopting it as a region of focus at this particular moment. But also, we acknowledge that there's stuff going on. We acknowledge that we have to pay attention, because I think that is important as an organization. We obviously can't cover every single conflict that's going on in the world. It's way beyond our abilities. And I think that the importance that we've given to adopting focus regions is something that I definitely stand behind. And maybe we can commit to that in terms of our ability to communicate both with our external audience, but also internally, and sort of say, look, this is something we have to acknowledge in terms of its importance to the type of work that we're doing, but also that maybe it might not necessarily be a big drive or a big thing that we pursue going forward in terms of the actual work that we're doing. We haven't, obviously, as Adi mentioned, it's not like deciding to take on a region of focus is a very long process. Very extensive research is required. I'm not going to shut the door on it, but I don't think at any point was the discussion, okay, is this going to be where we put our focus? I think it was more, how do we incorporate what we've learned here about what's going on in our own backyard and our own history, and apply those lessons and apply that consideration to the regions of focus that we currently have. Because if we disregard it entirely and pretend, okay, somebody else is doing that, we don't have to touch on it at all, it does bring to question the credibility of us as an organization, and sort of say, well, wait a second, you're not even looking at your experiences here. You're not even looking at how the reconciliation process worked or didn't work within your own backyard. So why should we take anything that you're saying seriously with regards to anything else? I know that's a really fine line to be walking, but I think that the distinguishment, that differentiation is really important in terms of the way we communicate both within STAN and to our external audiences.
What I love about this conversation, and the one that's been ongoing, is the conference was about promoting reflexivity. And I'm seeing that a lot in what we're talking about. We're taking an issue, we're talking about issues of representation with STAN in relation to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And then we think, oh wait, but what representation do we have in Burundi and in, or not in Burundi, but in South Sudan and Iraq and Syria? We potentially have better access to that kind of information here. And one of the recommendations that we're going to make is to build on that, not just from the point of view of Indigenous issues in Canada, but for all of our work generally. I want to talk specifically about these particular recommendations that we put together. But I want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to say what's on their mind.
Well, I guess I would note that when it comes to, like, I think at like obligation as an organization, I think Sarah like summed it up perfectly. Like, if we were to do nothing in response to the TRC, people would be rightfully calling us out for hypocrisy. But more so on an individual level, like, because I appreciate that it's a special case with most of British Columbia, but if you live south of Nunavut or the Northwest Territories, you are most likely subject to being on treaty land. And because it was the government of Canada that signed treaties with the First Nations, as Canadians, we are all treaty people. And that is something to remember, not only as we deal with our day-to-day activities as STAN members, but that is something incredibly important to remember as Canadians.
A big part of our role in this discussion will have to be just educating people on this issue, because despite the fact that it happened here, I think it's something that there's a huge gap in people's understanding or recognition of, you know, the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples and what happened historically. So even if I think our focus regions document specifically states that our focus regions are generally areas where there is either an ongoing genocide or risk of genocide. So according to that fairly strict interpretation, I would say that adopting Canada as a focus region is probably not something that we're likely to do. But I think it's really important that, not just for our own sake as an organization, making sure that people take us seriously, but just helping people understand the issue of genocide more broadly. We need to address. Yeah, helping us too. I mean, yeah, we are not going to transform into a Indigenous issues organization. We are not equipped to do that. There are other organizations out there doing that work better than we would be able to do. But as an organization that's concerned with genocide, this is something that we have to address, and that's going to be a process of learning and listening for all of us. So I just wanted to reiterate the importance of everybody sort of taking that on board, even if we're not sort of preparing campaigns or adopting it as a focus region. I think that's something that can really inform a lot of the work that we do.
I also think it's great that you said something, because from a national perspective, we want to be in constant conversation with chapters about the policies we put forward and how we are putting forward those policies. Like, it's very important that there's unity amongst
Internal policies.
Yeah, internal policies. It's really important that there's unity amongst chapters and national team. So, like, we appreciate you speaking up.
And one of the things that we want to be asking chapters is, if we are to do X, Y, Z based on what we're about to talk about, like, what do you need from us in order to make that happen? And for, you know, like, we need to be able to support you and not just like dump things on you. And we're very aware of that. Anyone else want to say something? I'm supposed to count to 10. I counted to 10, yes, okay. So a few things, we've talked about a few things. One of the ones that we came into this conference already thinking about, and that we discussed like many months ago now, is a revision to our official mandates to drop the word foreign from foreign policy. So currently, our mandate says STAN Canada, or our like official description of the organization is STAN Canada is a national youth-led organization working to make ending and preventing genocide a cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy. So the first recommendation that we as a group are putting forward is to drop the word foreign. I don't think that that has any serious implications for our work. It's just something that, to me, sticks out like a sore thumbnail. And it's not necessary. It's not a necessary word. So we want to hear thoughts on that. And just because there are lots of people who could still contribute to this conversation, like maybe we'll put out like a survey question on this or something and give everyone the opportunity to vote on it or something. But let's open that one there. It's a pretty small recommendation. But if anyone objects.
I don't object, but I kind of wanted to suggest an alternate wording, that instead of dropping foreign, we could add foreign and domestic policy. Because I think it's still within our scope to be addressing Canada's foreign policy, especially in relation to our focus regions. But we're adding, domestic policy or issues that are specifically domestic and that have no relation to countries outside of Canada. And I think that I think I have sort of an aesthetic bias towards that one. I think it sounds better, but I also think that it's a good way of sort of encompassing all of the different possible directions that we could take from this without sort of locking ourselves into one.
I wonder though if that introduces a binary into our work, in that it's either foreign or domestic. And I think that there's actually a lot of gray area in between, especially when it comes to corporate social responsibility and things like that.
Well, that's true. Like, I mean, for instance, the Conflict Minerals Act, is that an act of foreign policy? I mean, it refers to a situation that's taking place in a particular region of Africa, but it relates to the Canadian economy and it has, specific implications for Canadian companies and Canadian citizens. So there's not, the distinction isn't always clear cut. So yeah, maybe in that sense, it would just be better to say policy, but I think for clarity, foreign and domestic policy, and this is just a suggestion, we could maybe put it on the survey along with other options.
Other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I kind of like Emma's idea just because so much of the policy recommendations we have made are foreign policy, like that is what it is. And I think just saying policy, my reaction to that word would be predominantly domestic policy, which like we haven't really gone into that territory that much recently. We have been predominantly foreign policy based. So to just reduce that down to policy, it could be misleading. I think that's so foreign and domestic. I think it also really clears up kind of the areas in which we're engaged in, like all of the places in which we have our fingers. So yeah.
Yeah, so like in the course of my undergraduate work, I did come across scholarly articles that did make a case that resource development in Western Canada has led to genocide. And just with that in my background, it does lead me to think that in the future, there is a possibility that there may be claims of something similar as we go forward, where there may be rightful claims of genocide within Canada, and it does promote reflexivity as an organization to respond to any such needs to investigate.
Just for people who might be unfamiliar with the word, because people keep asking me, and it's because I am working in the educational studies a lot, right? I think that's sort of like in my head. But reflexivity is like reflection, but it also implies action, and that's kind of very basically how that word works. So yeah, good job.
I gave it an honest effort.
Anyone else want to chime in on this topic?
I just wanted to add that I also agree that perhaps we shouldn't just necessarily drop the word foreign, because I think it can be misinterpreted as, STAN being understood as primarily a domestic organization. And I think that because we did start as a foreign policy group, and I think that because a lot of our focus is on that, and because we haven't necessarily decided what we are doing with the Indigenous issue, I think that perhaps not maybe worded in a different way, but I think that it should be noted that it's both foreign and domestic policy, just because like right away, even when you said it, it just kind of, it kind of makes it seem as if STAND is mainly a domestic policy organization. And again, we do largely focus on foreign issues. So I think that the inclusion of the word foreign policy should be kind of worded in there somehow. Maybe not in a binary sense, but at the same time, I think that just dropping the word entirely would kind of change the meaning of our mission statement a little bit.
Yeah. Just by way of comparison, comparison of when major organizations or public agencies are working on policies that promotes inclusivity, they don't generalize it. What they do is spell out protections for every single minority group that they believe needs protection. So I would think that in applying that to Stan, we do need to actually spell it out. There's a good value to that.
Other people?
Yeah, I like the foreign and domestic as well. I don't think it necessarily has to create a binary. It depends how you apply that. Like something can be two things at once and not one or the other, I guess.
Does it make a difference if we pluralize policy? Does that make it less binary?
I think that makes it more binary because it sort of implies that they're each sort of unique items. Like there's foreign and domestic policy, and those two spheres are sort of onto themselves.
Okay, so I think that we heard a lot of good points there. And so I'll send out the survey. So people who are participating in this meeting in person, if you guys could also do the voting thing for whatever, because we didn't like record who said what, which we could hypothetically go back to this video, but I think it'd be pretty easy if we kept it all in one place and then had it in record in writing. So we'll include that. Another thing that we talked about doing was, it's actually been underway for a while, is publishing a list of genocides that's recognized by STAN Canada. So based on the focus regions procedure that we worked on last June with everybody and that town hall about that, we recognize, as Scott said very explicitly, we're a youth-based organization. We are not a research body. We are not a legal body. We don't have the ability to make the judgment genocide, not genocide. We're taking that out of our power because of the potential for that to be misused and abused and misapplied. So the kind of criteria that we've adopted is that any genocide recognized by the government of Canada is automatically within scope for us, including historical genocides for educational programming and whatnot. And the other set there would be the genocides recognized by the list of 5 NGOs that we have in the document, which are Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Crisis Group, the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies, and Enough Project, yes. Good. So of those 5 organizations, if there's some degree of consensus amongst them that genocide is happening, has happened, or could be happening in a very immediate sense in a particular region, then that also puts that within the scope of STAN. So the policy team has been working on compiling a list of this, providing descriptions and sources and justifications from the point of view of how we make these decisions, and that document is underway. So including Canada in that list is part of this. However, we had to limit the scope of this a little bit, because if we're going to say genocide for all time, that's really complicated. So what we kind of put together, and to bring it up with the group, this could change, is that because we're working in the context of Canadian policy, any genocide that happened before, that is considered to have happened before Canada ratified the Convention on Genocide Prevention.
The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide?
Yeah, that one.
So I believe that was 1948.
I think it was actually officially in the 50s.
Okay. But whenever it got ratified.
Yeah, when it was put into law in Canada.
Yeah.
So that puts it within the scope of Canadian policy, not just STAN. So any genocide committed after that time is something that we're looking at closely. Any genocide considered before that, we're only looking at what the government of Canada has acknowledged. So that would include the Armenian genocide and the Shoah and Ukraine, Holodomor, yeah. So where this fits in is interesting now because we have the TRC. The TRC report puts this within scope. It does mean that, for example, we wouldn't be looking at the United States, probably, because we wouldn't be basing this off NGOs. We would be basing this only off government policy. Okay. So that's one thing. Does anyone have any comments on that item?
Sorry, can I just clarify the purpose of compiling this list and kind of what it's supposed to achieve?
Just to make it like official, as like the official stance of STAN.
Okay. So
Because people do ask us,
Yeah.
and then related to that, we, like, our chapters, our central organization, we're often asked to participate in events related to historical genocide.
okay, so is this trying to shift? So like instead of consulting these external organizations, is this a potential shift to only considering what the Canadian government
No,
or like
only
post like 4850 whatever it is?
yeah, only before it was a crime in Canada, because we're looking at Canadian policy.
Yeah.
We're not going to look at genocides before that unless the Canadian government acknowledges it.
Okay, so this is just for like if someone asks or something and then you have a stance on it again.
Yeah.
Just to have it official.
Okay.
And then
something else STAN members would also have to like generalize it.
Yeah.
a useful reference, and then also like just like what we talked about with the focus regions procedure, to have these things written out doesn't mean that we have to stick to them with like, you know, to like with the wrath of God or whatever.
Yeah,
But
like having it written at least means that more of us are going to be on the same page.
and that if we make a mistake or if we change something, then we have a framework that we can justify that action, or that we have to justify ourselves against. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Another aspect that we talked about is the matter of acknowledgement. So we would have potentially the genocide of First Nations people in Canada listed in our list of genocide. There would have to be some sort of footnote about cultural genocide, I imagine. Because we'd be including it on the list as genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be tricky, so that's a whole other issue that I don't think we can talk about right now. We'll develop the document and the wording and then look at it more closely and then bring it to the group. But acknowledgement, for example, that we didn't do at the beginning of this meeting, but we've done at the beginning of the conference, of territory acknowledgement. And then potentially for STAN Canada could be something like an acknowledgement of territory in terms of Turtle Island, which you would have to like provide an explanation to the whole group about.
Yeah,
it's like a term that people use to reference Canada when they don't want to say like Canada. It's like it's like a decolonial kind of.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, for Canada. So we could incorporate that kind of wording into our website and official mandate. We could incorporate it into official documents, and then I think even more importantly for chapters, to educate our members about how to conduct some sort of acknowledgement in actual physical events on physical spaces, which I think could be an important shift, though would be complicated based on regional differences. It would not be a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And also, as STAN, like we would be encouraging every chapter to connect with Indigenous groups on their campus or in their area.
And to provide greater clarity, if you haven't seen an acknowledgement at a public meeting, it is usually at the start of a public meeting, and it is just a simple acknowledgement. In the case of our acknowledgements during this conference, it was that our meeting is unceded territory.
Traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo peoples.
Yeah. And if a meeting is taking place on the prairies where you have the number treaties, you have an acknowledgement, well, in the case of Edmonton, that you are on Treaty 6 territory and the parties to that treaty.
But at the same time, we don't want this to be like just a kind of thing that people say at the beginning of meetings. We want them to have meaning in some way. So another thing that we said at the beginning of this conference is that we hope that the conference itself helps to honor the space that we're on through the nature of the conversation and the attitude that we're taking towards each other and the relationships that we're building. I struggle with this question of how do we make it meaningful and not lip service. Anyone have any thoughts on this?
the most important thing is to build links between STAND and Indigenous organizations and Indigenous people, because I think that's really the key to getting a greater understanding of the issues that have arisen out of cultural genocide or genocide of Indigenous peoples. And it's something that's really good to keep in mind, just because of the fact that Indigenous people are often underrepresented in a lot of the same spheres in which we operate, in government, in academia, and generally sort of college life. I think Indigenous peoples are to varying degrees underrepresented, and you don't often hear these perspectives. So I think the most important thing is just forming those relationships and opening those communication lines, maybe more so than the statements or the verbal statements of acknowledgement, is really sort of having a meaningful conversation with the groups that are made up of people who are experiencing these things now, and you have greater knowledge than we do about the history.
So I'd like to hear from chapters on that and the feasibility of that kind of implementation, what you guys think of it generally, how it relates to things you might already be doing.
I personally think it's a good idea to do that. Like, I fully support the idea, but I think with that definitely comes an education piece. I think with the members we have right now, at least in the UBC chapter, I think everyone will agree that it's a good idea, and everyone will also understand the meaning of that and the value behind that statement. But at the same time, if there are new members who may not be as familiar with these issues and these concerns, I think with that, it would be helpful to have like a standard document or like official document that, explains why we're doing this in a more deep and meaningful way that helps new members kind of like understand why we're doing it, and also it's an educational piece as well. So I will support the idea, but I think with that kind of becomes other things that we do.
I think maybe one of those other things that we could do is, as national, is actually facilitate the connection between every chapter and Indigenous groups in their area. To actually maybe bring an elder to come speak to you guys, to teach you guys about what that means, to do that acknowledgement. We could work on doing that. Other chapters? Is this something that you guys would be interested in participating in? Lori doesn't have audio, so they're going to email me after. And you can also text me. I'm checking my email just in case.
Good idea.
There's an event at UBC on the psychology of genocide this week. I know. I'm sorry. The calendar is just getting so cool.
That happened earlier this week, or?
It's on, just got a reminder, it's on Wednesday.
What time?
It's at 4 in the nest. Ooh.
I'm still in the city, so.
Oh, cool. You should do that.
Yeah.
There's indirect support, which you can like punch in people's names and you can see when they're actually.
I'm just going to specifically ask, Mariam, do you have any thoughts on this particular subject?
I think at least my chapter would be really interested in doing something like that. Just because when I did speak to some of our members earlier this week about this subject, a lot of us think that at the very least we do owe it to kind of facilitate the discussion of Indigenous issues. And I think that getting in contact with actual Indigenous groups would really help that, because right now we have a very outward perspective. We kind of are getting all of our information from either online or that type of thing. So I think having internal perspective from someone who is Indigenous and who does specialize in Indigenous issues, I think it would really kind of help us better understand this issue. And I think that would kind of put us towards the next step of figuring out what exactly we are going to do or not do about the Indigenous genocide and how that kind of relates to our mandate with STAND. So personally, our chapter, I mean, getting in touch with, especially with an elder, I think that would be not only just a really useful thing to do just for in terms of understanding the conversation and for kind of, you know, contributing to that subject, but just personally too, I think that would just be a really great learning experience. So I kind of think that would be a great idea. And Addie, I'll start emailing you about, you know, more specifics and kind of getting in touch with those type of groups. So personally, our chapter would probably be really interested in something like that.
Awesome. Western? You still there? Okay, and then Lori, I'll hear from you. So we're gonna make sure to talk to you two individually. Tori over here is going to be doing a check-in with everybody. Do you wanna mention that really quick?
So yeah, probably at the beginning of, or sometime in February, I want to have like a individual meeting with each of the chapter presidents or whoever you want to come to the conversation, just to talk about like what we're doing in the national team and what you guys have upcoming for the semester and how we can help you, essentially.
And so that will be part of the discussion to like work out those specifics of how this is gonna work on every campus, potentially. So once we talk about this more. This ties into the next topic that we discussed, which is community outreach. So one of the, as we're restructuring our advocacy team right now, we are affirming one of the longstanding like desires of STAND to connect in a meaningful way with diaspora communities from each of our focus regions and really develop those connections in a serious way. And then in addition to that, we would include Indigenous groups, which would facilitate a bunch of other things. And a lot of other ideas that we have going. So that would be an official advocacy objective. So for advocacy, there would be 3 outreach priorities. First would be government, second would be community, and third would be corporations. Any thoughts on that?
Probably shouldn't whisper. But no, I mean, that's something I know about trying to facilitate that connection with that like local population who, you know, have a more personal connection than we do, especially as we talked about before about like none of us are Indigenous. So, and we're in Canada and we feel like we have a closer connection there. I mean, the connection with like Sudan is even harder to establish in a way.
Yeah.
So I'm full support. Personally, I hope my group is too. I think most of us.
We also see that this is something that national can do for chapters, in that you guys, just based on like changing executives and like the logistics of being, like most of you are probably full-time students. So for national, like what we're really going to try to invest in the long term, and then specifically for this issue, but also for others, is to develop a kind of database of connections for you guys and actually just like connect you with people instead of having you guys do that work.
We definitely did a lot of that outreach work for in preparation for this conference. We did only send invitations to only Indigenous groups, but we also sent them
or in Vancouver.
Yeah, or in Vancouver.
Yeah.
But we reached out to a variety of organizations across Canada with members, also non-Indigenous members too.
That's something that communications is going to be focusing on too for the upcoming year. Just trying to share some of those experiences through things like podcasts and blog posts and things like that. So if something comes out of these discussions at the chapter level or these connections that you make that you think would make a good blog post or a piece of media that could be shared either through social media or on our website, please send it to us. Along with a brief sort of description of what it's about and maybe links and information about the people involved in it, the people you're speaking with specifically. And we'll be happy to share the work that you've done and work with you to develop that further. So just something to keep in mind.
I just wanted to add that I think it's a really good idea as well. Just because personally with our chapter, we do feel a little disconnected just because a lot of the things we do are very don't necessarily make a direct impact impact. So I think that getting in touch with, groups in the different, from our different focus regions, I think that it would kind of make things more personal. I think it would make things a little more easier to tackle, just because right now everything is so like detached and very long distance. And so I think that, and especially if the national team does help us kind of get in touch with those groups, I think it would really kind of help with morale. And I think it would really just help with kind of making meaningful impact and making meaningful changes, because I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of our mandate. And I think that at this point, it's just like, it's a lot of like disconnection. And I think it's a lot of like, okay, we're doing this, but what are the tangible results? Like, who are we affecting? How are we helping? So I think getting in touch with those community groups would really just take us to the next level.
To sort of add on to that, and as somebody who works in the communication side of things, I'm always very interested in seeing how we can better incorporate chapter contributions to the stuff that we're publishing on the website. So something that was really interesting to me over the course of this weekend, and I think you've touched on there, is if we can get chapters involved on sort of that community level and dealing with groups, within the local community, and either bringing along somebody from Exact if we're able to come, if we live in the city. For example, I'm in Toronto, so it's easy enough for me to get to Toronto events. Not so easy for me to get to Calgary events, but easy for me to get to Toronto events. But also putting in a space perhaps where people from the chapter level can take these experiences that they're having through the process of community outreach and being able to say, okay, well, can I turn this into a podcast maybe, or a blog post, or is this something that I had enough of an interest in that perhaps we could share pictures from the event, or maybe I have a couple words I could write about the experience, and then just having national support you at that level and sort of say, okay, great, here's some stuff that's specifically been created by our chapters, and keep it almost as a distinct thing from the volunteer blog writers I have, which are more at the national level, and sort of say, okay, hey, look, this is what you guys are doing, and you guys can sort of feed off that and have it be almost a cyclical thing. I think there's definitely opportunity for collaboration there if that's something that the chapters are interested in doing. Obviously not to put any more work on anybody else who doesn't want it, but I'm speaking from the blog perspective, I'm certainly interested in being able to present materials that are created specifically from a chapter point of view.
And I want to emphasize there that the podcasts are super easy to do. Like, you can do them over your computer. We can give you access to this app to automatically record events. And then all you have to do is upload the file to Google Drive and send it to us. And the communications team will do all the like editing and introductions and stuff like that. So the podcast, we should maybe make like a handbook for this, I'm realizing. But that's a super easy thing to do just for a conversation, online or in person. Record it, and why not share it with everybody?
We're there to support you too through the process of getting it up online, and we can give you tips on recording. We can help you develop a set of questions to ask your speaker. There's all sorts of ways in which we can support the stuff that you're doing. So I just emphasize to keep that in mind and to remember, us and try and make it a collaborative enterprise partly as a way of just reducing the workload on you, but also sharing the experiences and the capacities that we have at the national level to try and help get the message out at the chapter level.
Yeah, and not just for communications too. Like, if you need help recruiting, please talk to Tori or Adi and get in touch, and they'll get in touch with me, or we'll all get in touch, and I can definitely help you and use the resources I have too.
Yeah, we'll be talking about this more in the check-in. Any last thoughts before we move on to the final two things that I have on this list?
Just one more thing, I'm going to throw it out there quickly. I know Soleil, you're the only one right now who's coming in from abroad, but just to speak more broadly to people who are either traveling or living abroad for whatever particular reason, there's nothing to prevent you from contacting local groups in your own area as well. We are a Canadian organization. The Canadian perspective is important, but that doesn't mean, I think if we've taken away anything from this conference this weekend, it's that a lot of the lessons that we've learned, a lot of the experiences that we have or that we've witnessed are, I don't want to say cross-cultural, but they're relatable in any culture. And there's certainly value to bringing in different perspectives like that from wherever you happen to be. Again, no pressure and by no means any obligation, but it is something to consider. I know we've got Slay, you're in Australia. I have somebody in Tanzania right now. We've got a couple people who are all over the place who might be like, oh, hey, look, I happen to met this person who has a really interesting perspective on some of the stuff that Stan talks about. Here's something we can discuss, or here's a blog post I can write about it, or whatever it happens to be. Just to reiterate what's been said so far, we're here to support you. You know, email us or ask Adi to email us, and we'll do that for you.
Well, we have the same email. So. Chapters@stancanada.org. Any other thoughts before we move on? Community outreach. Okay, another thing that we have for the missing and murdered
Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women.
Aboriginal women, or the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls inquiry. To publish news about it on our blog in addition to all the rest of our news. I don't know if people are aware of that one. Might have to wait a little bit. But.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a learning curve on that. Yeah, I think it's definitely worth publicizing because it does specifically relate to some of the systemic issues that were identified in the GRC report. But again, we're not going to expect everybody to know the ins and outs of this issue intimately.
For sure,
right now. So,
like for our focus regions, we it's our responsibility with national to give the chapters the educational opportunities to learn a lot about the focus regions. But we publicize information, like news information related to a lot of things that aren't in our focus regions. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
So to add this to that kind of list of topics to watch out for. Yeah,
this is definitely going to be a topic that we're watching and paying very close attention to, and it's something that's going to be ongoing, possibly for years. So yeah, it's not like we're on a very short time scale here or anything, but yeah, I would encourage everybody to learn as much as they can about that, and we're going to be doing some work internally within communications to try and make sure that we're producing reflects our goals as an organization and all the stuff that we've learned this weekend and sort of the collective experiences of the people who stand.
Anyone else on that topic? I'll put it in the survey thing. And then also potentially just an idea that we threw around just before this meeting started is that there's like a National Aboriginal Day in June. Maybe we could, maybe we could host some event or a panel discussion or something online about that. But we'll see where we are at that time of year.
And there's going to be further opportunities for a dialogue as the Missing Women's Inquiry progresses.
So those are the things on our list. Any other final comments before we can wrap up?
I just want to say that, like, I think everyone who volunteers with STAND or is part of STAND recognizes that we're all young and we will make mistakes, but the key is to ask your team and ask people questions, like reach out to us and also answer your emails. That's key.
Yes.
And within the STAND National, we have a 48-hour response rule. I don't know if that still applies to chapters too, but yeah.
Well, we don't have a hard and fast rule for that, but we also, if you don't like writing emails or reading emails, you can always pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just important to make sure that you're in communication if somebody's reached out to you.
Even if you can't answer, say, oh, I can't answer, but I can get back to you on this date.
Great. We have a ton of material to share with you guys from this conference now, and I'm really excited to hear from everybody what they think and to see how we can get this conversation going on a national level, which is a challenge for us as an online organization and for chapters who are at significant distance from each other. I really think that we have the opportunity now to do something really different. even if it's just facilitating this type of national dialogue, not even looking at the topic, right? We could really pull this off, and I really want to be able to share this with everyone and generate passion and enthusiasm within the organization. So this was kind of a first step towards that goal, and I hope that everybody feels like their time was well spent. We are just past the 90-minute mark here. Well, we started a bit late, so technically under 90 minutes. Good job, everybody. So thank you so much for those of you who came in, especially for this. We really appreciate it. We're going to continue the conversation. This video will be made available on YouTube. If you are uncomfortable with the information being public, just let me know and I will unlist the video, and then we can still share it within Stand Canada. And then just like random people wouldn't be able to find it. So that is available to you. The conference information will be coming up over the next couple of weeks as we get consent, and we want to make sure that we get full consent. A lot of the material that we touched on was really sensitive and personal, and we want to do the best that we can to respect the rights of the people who share that information, and we're generous to do that. So thank you again, and thank you to all the people who organized this, and this is the final event for the conference. So thank you. If I could get the chapters to just stick around for 30 seconds. I just want to do something with you really quick. I'm going to turn off the recording. Soleil, you can go back to sleep. And thank you again.
Thanks for joining us.
Tori.